Thomas Edward Reynolds sat in the sunroom of the Riverside Hospice in Cincinnati, Ohio, with a yellow legal pad resting on his knees and a black ballpoint pen that had already begun to skip. Outside the wide window, the Ohio River moved the color of old steel under a late October sky. The trees on the Kentucky side had turned the hard, stubborn red of the season's end. He was 68 years old. 2 weeks earlier, the oncologist had stopped using the word hope. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 6 to 8 weeks if the numbers held, 4 if they did not. He had declined further chemotherapy. He had signed the papers that turned the remaining days over to comfort care. The only requests he made were simple: a private room with a view of the water and a steady supply of legal pads and pens. The nurses believed he was writing letters to family. He had no family left who would open them. He uncapped the pen. The first sentence came slowly, the letters careful and deliberate. "My name is Thomas Edward Reynolds, and I killed my daughter." He stared at the line for a long time. The words looked too sharp on the page, too final. He drew a single line through them and began again. "My name is Thomas Edward Reynolds. I was born in 1958 in a 2-bedroom house outside Dayton, Ohio. I had a daughter named Sarah Louise. She died because of choices I made. This is the only true account I will leave behind." He kept writing. The years before Sarah arrived had been ordinary in the way most lives are ordinary when people are still young enough to believe ordinary is enough. In 1987, he and Diane bought a small brick ranch on Maple Street in Kettering. 3 bedrooms, 1-car garage, a backyard that ended at a drainage ditch lined with weeds. He worked second shift at the Tulane dye plant. Diane taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 3 miles away. They were 29 and 27. On weekends, they mowed the lawn and painted the kitchen cabinets a pale yellow Diane had chosen from a chip at the hardware store. They talked about saving for a bigger house someday, about maybe taking a vacation to the Smoky Mountains. Nothing in those conversations prepared either of them for the wait that would come later. Sarah Louise Reynolds was born in March 1988 at Miami Valley Hospital. 6 pounds, 11 ounces, dark hair like her mother, long fingers like her father's. The first night home, Thomas sat in the wooden rocking chair in the nursery with the baby against his chest. He can still remember the exact warmth of her, the small rise and fall of her breathing, the way her fist opened and closed against his shirt. He remembers thinking, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was the only perfect thing he would ever do. For 4 years, the days followed a quiet pattern. Mortgage payments. Grocery lists written on the back of envelopes. Saturday morning cartoons, while Diane graded papers at the kitchen table. Sarah learned to walk by holding the edge of the coffee table, then the couch, then nothing at all. She carried a worn stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons everywhere, into the bathtub, into the grocery cart, into bed. In the evenings after supper, she liked to sit on the back steps and watch the sky for airplanes. She would point and say the word plane over and over until it became clear and proud in her mouth. Thomas would sit beside her sometimes, the two of them quiet, the sky fading from blue to the softer colors of dusk. In 1992, the plant promoted him to shift supervisor. The raise was modest but real. The hours grew longer. He began staying later to finish paperwork, to walk the floor one more time, to make sure the numbers looked right before he left. Diane stopped waiting up. Distance between them grew the way ice forms on a windshield in winter, slowly at first, then all at once, until the view was gone. The summer of 1993, the company sent him to a 3-day management seminar in Chicago. That was where he met Linda Carney. Linda was 28, newly divorced, and worked in human resources for a larger firm based in Columbus. She was tall, direct in the way people are when they have already decided not to waste time. She laughed with her whole mouth. At the hotel bar after the first day of sessions, she told Thomas he looked like a man who had forgotten how to want anything for himself. He bought her a second drink. By the 3rd night, they were in her room on the 14th floor. The city lights spread out below them like something that did not belong to either of their ordinary lives. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself every man has a moment of weakness. He told himself Diane would never know. He returned to Ohio with Linda's number written on a folded conference napkin in his wallet. 2 weeks later, he called her from a pay phone outside the plant. Within 3 months, he was driving to Columbus on weekends, telling Diane he had overtime. Within 6 months, he had a change of clothes and a spare razor in Linda's apartment. Diane found the second phone bill in February 1994. She did not raise her voice. She sat at the kitchen table with the itemized page in front of her and asked only one question. "It's serious?" Thomas said yes. The divorce moved quickly. He agreed to child support and every other weekend visitation. Diane kept the house on Maple Street. He moved into Linda's place in the northern suburbs of Columbus. Sarah was 6 years old. The first visitation weekend, she stood in the doorway of the new apartment holding Mr. Buttons against her chest and would not take off her coat. Linda tried. She offered ice cream, a cartoon on television, a tour of the backyard. Sarah shook her head once and asked when Daddy was taking her home. Thomas drove her back to Kettering that same night. On the highway, he told her things would get better. She looked out the passenger window at the dark fields and did not answer. Visitation thinned after that. Every third weekend, then once a month. Sarah stopped calling him Daddy. She began saying, "Tom," the way a child tests a word that tastes wrong in the mouth. He sent the support checks on the first of every month without fail. He remembered birthdays with money orders and short cards that said the expected things. He told himself he was still a father because the checks cleared and the cards were signed. Linda wanted a clean start. She wanted children of their own. She never said Sarah was unwelcome, but the guest room stayed bare, and the photographs on the mantel showed only the two of them smiling in places Sarah had never been. When Sarah came to visit, Linda found reasons to be elsewhere: errands, a friend who needed help, a long walk. Thomas told himself it was temporary friction. He told himself children adapt. He told himself a great many things that allowed him to keep living the life he had chosen. In the fall of 1995, the telephone rang at the plant. Diane's voice was steady in the particular way people become steady when the alternative is falling apart completely. "Sarah's been sick. The doctors found something in her blood. They want to start treatment right away. It's aggressive. Insurance is already fighting the out-of-network specialists. I need you to help, Tom. Not just the monthly check. Real help." Closed the office door. He could hear the steady noise of the plant floor through the wall. He said he would look into it. He hung up and sat looking at the wall calendar for a long time, the dates already filled with meetings and production numbers that suddenly seemed both urgent and meaningless. That night he told Linda everything the doctors had said. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke in the calm voice she used when she had already decided the practical path. "You're already paying support. If you start covering experimental treatment, where does it end? We have our own life to build. You're not made of money." He nodded. He said he understood. The next day he called Diane and told her he would cover ordinary copays and nothing more. The specialized protocol was too expensive and too uncertain. Standard treatment would have to be enough. Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She's 9 years old. She asks for you every night." Answered, "I've done what I can." Did not visit the hospital during the first round of chemotherapy. He sent a card with a check for $500. The check was never cashed. The second call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March 1997. Diane's sister was on the line. Sarah had developed a severe infection after the latest treatment. Her white blood cell counts were nearly gone. The hospital was doing everything the insurance would allow. Diane had been at the bedside for 36 hours. Thomas left the plant early. He drove the 90 minutes to Dayton with the radio off and the windows closed. He sat in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes before he made himself get out of the car. Sarah was in a single room on the pediatric oncology floor. The lights were low. Machines made soft, steady sounds that filled the silence. She looked smaller than he remembered. The stuffed rabbit was tucked under one thin arm. Her eyes were closed. Diane sat in the chair beside the bed. She looked up when he entered and then looked away toward the window. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed and said her name. Sarah's eyes opened slowly. For a moment there was recognition. She tried to speak. The sound that came out was only air. He took her hand. It was hot and almost weightless. He told her he was there. He told her she was going to be all right. He did not know if any of the words reached her. A nurse came in and asked him to step into the hallway so they could adjust the lines. Diane's sister met him there and told him, in a voice kept carefully low, that the doctors did not expect Sarah to last the night. Thomas drove back to Columbus. Linda was waiting in the kitchen. She asked how it had gone. He said it was bad. She put her arms around him and said he had done everything he could. He let her believe it because it was easier than saying the truth out loud. Sarah Louise Reynolds died at 4:17 the next afternoon. Diane was holding her hand. Thomas was sitting in a budget meeting across town, looking at columns of numbers that no longer meant anything. He did not attend the funeral. Linda said it would only open wounds that needed to stay closed. He sent white lilies and a card that read, "With sympathy, Thomas and Linda Reynolds." That night he drank until the room tilted and the edges of the furniture softened. In the morning he shaved, put on a clean shirt, and went to work as if the previous day had been ordinary. The years that followed settled into a long, quiet pattern. He and Linda never had children of their own. The doctors said the difficulty was on her side. She left him in 2011 for a man who already had 2 teenage sons and a boat docked on a lake in Michigan. The divorce was quiet and almost polite. Thomas kept the house for a year, then sold it and moved into a smaller place near the river. He retired at 62 with a pension that was enough and no one to leave it to. He walked the same path along the water every morning. He shopped at the same grocery store on the same day each week. He paid his bills on time. People who knew him only in passing called him a private man, a solid man, a man who had kept to himself after a difficult marriage. None of them knew the full shape of what he carried. He never spoke of Sarah. When someone asked if he had children, he said no. In the spring of 2025, a letter arrived from a law firm in Dayton. Diane had died of heart failure. Among her papers was a sealed envelope with his name on the front. Inside was a single photograph of Sarah at 7 years old, sitting on the back steps of the Maple Street house with Mr. Buttons in her lap, looking up at the sky the way she always had. On the back, in Diane's careful teacher handwriting, were 2 sentences. She asked for you every night until the end. I never told her you refused the treatment money. I let her believe you were still trying. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of him until the light left the windows and the room went dark. Then he put the picture in a drawer and did not look at it again for 6 months. The pain began in August, a deep, persistent ache that did not belong to ordinary aging. By September, the diagnosis was confirmed. By the first week of October, he had moved into the hospice room with the view of the river. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping that first afternoon. His hand cramped. He flexed the fingers and continued. He wrote about the night in Chicago. He wrote the exact words he had used when he told Diane the marriage was over. He wrote about the change in Sarah's face the first time she called him Tom instead of Daddy. He wrote about the telephone call in which he said no to the money that might have bought more time. He wrote about sitting in the hospital parking lot and choosing to drive home instead of staying. He wrote the truth without trying to make it softer. A nurse named Carol looked in at shift change. She was in her early 60s, gray hair pulled back, eyes that had already seen too many last weeks. She noticed the legal pad and asked if he was writing to family. He said, "Just setting things down." She nodded as if the answer explained more than the words themselves. "Sometimes that's the only thing left that feels useful." She left. He kept writing until the light outside had gone completely and the river was only a darker shape moving under the night. Thomas wrote until the corridor lights dimmed and the hospice settled into its nighttime quiet. The legal pad filled with page after page of the same steady handwriting. He did not try to make the sentences beautiful. He only tried to make them true. He wrote about the first months after the divorce, when the weekends with Sarah still carried a fragile hope that something might be repaired. He described the way she would stand just inside the door of Linda's apartment, coat still zipped, Mr. Buttons pressed to her chest, eyes moving across the unfamiliar furniture as if searching for a place that belonged to her. He wrote about the afternoon he took her to a small park near the apartment complex and pushed her on a swing while Linda stayed behind, saying she had work to finish. Sarah had been quiet the entire time. When he asked if she wanted to go higher, she only shook her head. On the drive back to Kettering, she fell asleep against the door, the stuffed rabbit slipping from her hands onto the floor mat. He remembered reaching over at a red light to pick it up and feeling, for a moment, the full weight of what he had broken. He wrote about the gradual thinning of those visits. How the every other weekend schedule became every third weekend, then once a month, then irregular. How the phone calls grew shorter. How Sarah's voice on the line changed from the bright, questioning tone of a child who still expected her father to fix things into something flatter, more careful. He recorded the exact day he first heard her call him Tom. It had been a Saturday in late autumn. He had driven down to pick her up, and she had come out of the house on Maple Street already wearing her coat. Diane stood in the doorway behind her, arms folded. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, fastened the seatbelt herself, and said, "Hi, Tom." The word landed between them like a small, deliberate stone. He had corrected her once gently. She had not used the old name again. Linda's presence in those years was steady and practical. She never raised her voice about Sarah. She simply arranged the household so that the child's visits required the least possible disruption. The guest room remained undecorated. The refrigerator held no special snacks. The photographs on the living room shelves showed Linda and Thomas on vacations Sarah had never taken. Lake Michigan one summer, a long weekend in the Smoky Mountains another. When Sarah came, Linda often found reasons to be out of the house. Thomas told himself this was reasonable. He told himself a second marriage needed protecting. He told himself children were resilient. He wrote all of it down without trying to soften the edges. On the third morning in the hospice, Carol brought him a fresh legal pad and a cup of tea he did not drink. She stood for a moment looking at the stack of filled pages on the small table beside his chair. "You're working hard," she said. "Trying to finish before I can't," he answered. She nodded. "I've seen a lot of people try to get the story straight at the end. Most of them run out of time." Looked at the river. "I don't intend to." She left. He returned to the page. He wrote about the autumn of 1995 in greater detail. The first telephone call from Diane, the exact wording of the diagnosis as he remembered it, the long silence after he hung up. He described the evening he told Linda, the way she listened with her head slightly tilted, the calm practicality of her response. He did not excuse himself in the retelling. He simply set the words down in the order they had happened. He wrote about the decision not to fund the specialized protocol. He recorded the conversation with Diane almost word for word, the quiet that followed his refusal, the single sentence she spoke about Sarah asking for him every night. He wrote the lie he told himself afterward, that the standard treatment would be enough, that the doctors were being overly cautious, that children recovered from these things more often than people admitted. He wrote the quieter truth beneath the lie, that the money would have required dipping into the savings he and Linda were building for a future that did not include Sarah, and that he had chosen the future that felt easier to live inside. The days in the hospice took on a rhythm, morning light on the river, the soft sound of nurses' shoes in the hallway, the slow accumulation of pages. He slept in short stretches and woke with the same heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cancer. Carol checked on him at regular intervals. Sometimes she asked if he needed anything. Sometimes she simply stood in the doorway for a moment and then moved on. He found her presence steadying in a way he did not try to explain. On the fourth day, he asked her for a large envelope and a book of stamps. He had decided what to do with the pages. Linda's son from her first marriage, Michael, was the only person left who might still open something with Thomas's name on it. They had never been close. During the years of the second marriage, Michael had been a teenager, then a young man living in another city, polite at holidays and distant the rest of the time. After the divorce, the contact had faded to almost nothing. Thomas had not pushed. He had told himself the boy had his own life. The truth was simpler. He had not known what to say to him. He addressed the envelope in careful block letters, folded the 30-odd pages he had written so far, and sealed it. Carol took it to the outgoing mail without asking questions. 2 days later, the telephone in his room rang. Carol answered, listened, and held the receiver out to him. "It's for you." Michael's voice was controlled, the words measured. "I got the package." Read the first 20 pages. "Is this some kind of performance?" "No," Thomas said. "You're telling me you let a 9-year-old die because the treatment cost too much and your new wife didn't want the expense." Closed his eyes. The river outside was the same dull steel color it had been all week. "Yes." Was a long silence on the line. Then Michael said, "I'm driving down tomorrow. Don't die before I get there." He hung up without saying goodbye. Thomas set the receiver down. For a while he sat without writing. The confession had left the private space of the legal pad and entered the world. There was no taking it back. That night he slept even less than usual. The pain in his abdomen had settled into a constant low burn that the medication only dulled. He refused the stronger dose the night nurse offered. He wanted his mind clear when Michael arrived. The next afternoon, Michael stood in the doorway of the sunroom wearing a work jacket with the name of a construction company stitched over the pocket. He was taller than Thomas remembered, graying at the temples, the same careful set to his mouth that Linda had always had when she was deciding how much to say. "I read all of it," Michael said. "Twice." Waited. Michael pulled a chair close to the window and sat. He kept his hands clasped between his knees. I've been trying to find the moment you turned into something I could hate cleanly. It isn't there. That's the part that stays with me. You just kept choosing the smaller, easier thing, one decision after another until a child was gone. Nodded. He had no argument left that would hold. Michael looked out at the river for a long time before he spoke again. My mother never told me any of this. She talked about you like you were simply a disappointment, not like you were capable of standing in a parking lot and deciding not to stay. She didn't know the full extent, Thomas said. I never told her I had refused the additional treatment money. I let her believe the doctors had already done everything possible. Michael's jaw tightened. So you lied to her too? Yes, they sat without speaking. The light on the water shifted as clouds moved across the afternoon sun. Finally, Michael said, I don't know what you expect from me. Nothing, Thomas answered. I only needed one person still living to know the truth. You were the only name I had left. Michael stood. He looked older than his 41 years. I'm not going to forgive you. I'm not sure I even understand what that word is supposed to mean in a situation like this. But I'll keep the pages. Someone should. Left without offering his hand. After the sound of his footsteps faded, Thomas asked Carol for a fresh legal pad. The pain medication made his thoughts slower now, but he refused to increase the dose enough to blur the work. He wrote about the day Sarah died, and the budget meeting he had chosen to attend instead of returning to the hospital. He wrote about the white lilies and the card that carried both his name and Linda's. He wrote about the long years of answering no when anyone asked if he had children. He wrote about the photograph Diane had left him and the 2 sentences on the back that had finally broken the last wall he had built around the memory. He wrote until there was nothing more to put down. On the final page, he set only these lines. I do not ask to be understood. I do not ask to be forgiven. I ask only that the record exist. My daughter's name was Sarah Louise Reynolds. She deserved a father who would have sold everything he owned to keep her alive. She received me instead. That is the whole of it. He signed his full name and the date beneath the last sentence. Carol found him the next morning still in the chair by the window, the legal pad closed on his lap, the pen on the floor beside his foot. The river outside held the same color it had carried the day he arrived. She called the number Michael had left. He drove down that afternoon and took the finished pages. He did not cry in the room. He stood at the window for a long time looking at the water, then turned and left with the envelope under his arm. In the parking lot, he sat in his truck with the pages on the passenger seat and allowed himself 5 full minutes of a feeling that was neither pure grief nor pure anger. Then he started the engine and drove north toward Indianapolis. He kept the pages in a locked drawer in his house. He never showed them to anyone. Years later, after his own children were grown, he took them out once and read the final paragraph again under the light of a desk lamp. Then he returned them to the drawer and closed it. The river kept moving, indifferent and constant. Thomas Edward Reynolds was buried in a modest plot outside Dayton under a simple stone that carried only his name and the years of his life. No one added the words beloved father. No one needed to. The truth had already been written down, and that, in the end, was the only mercy left to him. In the years before the Chicago seminar, the house on Maple Street had still held the shape of a life Thomas believed he wanted. The mornings began early. Diane left for school while the sky was still pale. Thomas worked the later shift and came home to a kitchen that smelled of whatever she had cooked and left warming in the oven. Sarah would already be in her pajamas, hair damp from the bath, waiting for him on the living room carpet with Mr. Buttons under one arm. He would sit on the floor beside her and listen to the small reports of her day, what color she had used in art class, which classmate had shared crackers at snack time, whether the class guinea pig had been awake or asleep. The conversations were simple. He had not yet learned how much weight simple things could carry once they were gone. On weekends, they took short drives into the countryside south of Dayton. Diane packed sandwiches. Sarah sat in the back seat nomming the cows and horses they passed. Thomas remembers one afternoon in particular, the summer Sarah turned 4. They had stopped at a small roadside park with a single swing set and a view of open fields. He pushed her on the swing while Diane sat on a bench reading. Sarah leaned back, dark hair lifting in the air, and laughed with her whole body. When she grew tired, she climbed down and came to him with both arms raised. He lifted her, and she rested her head against his shoulder, the stuffed rabbit caught between them. For a moment, the ordinary afternoon felt complete. He did not know then that he would spend the rest of his life measuring other moments against that one and finding them smaller. The distance began in small ways. After the promotion in 1992, the plant required more of his evenings. Production numbers, overtime schedules, the quiet pressure of being the man other men looked to when something went wrong on the floor. He started bringing paperwork home. Diane stopped asking him to leave it in the car. They still ate dinner together most nights, but the talk grew thinner. Sarah noticed before either of them admitted it. One evening she climbed into his lap while he sat at the kitchen table with a stack of inventory sheets and said, "You're not looking at me, Daddy." He set the papers aside and held her, but the interruption stayed with him longer than it should have. He told himself he was building something for the three of them. He told himself the long hours were temporary. At the time the company sent him to Chicago, he had already begun to feel the restlessness that later made Linda possible. He could not have named it clearly then. It lived in the way he lingered in the car after parking in the driveway, the way he sometimes drove the long way home from the plant, the way ordinary kindnesses from Diane began to feel like obligations rather than gifts. He was 35 years old and had started to believe that the life he was living was the only one available to him. The seminar was supposed to be 3 days of charts and strategy sessions. It became something else the first evening he sat at the hotel bar and listened to Linda Carney laugh. She was not beautiful in the way magazines define the word. She was vivid. She spoke as if the conversation already belonged to her. When she looked at him, she did not look away first. The second night she told him about her brief marriage, the way it had ended without drama, the relief she had felt at reclaiming her own time. He told her about the plant, about Sarah, about the house on Maple Street. He left out the restlessness. He left out the sense that he was already standing slightly outside his own life, watching it continue without him. By the third night, the decision had made itself. He returned to Ohio carrying her number and a version of himself that no longer fit the kitchen on Maple Street. The first phone call from the pay phone outside the plant felt like stepping through a door he had not known was unlocked. The weekends in Columbus began soon after. He told Diane the plant needed him for overtime. She believed him at first. Later, she simply stopped asking. When she found the second phone bill, she did not cry. She sat at the table with the paper in front of her and waited for him to speak. The question she asked, "Is it serious?" contained more dignity than he deserved. He answered yes because lying further seemed suddenly pointless. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way a house becomes quiet after something is broken and neither person is ready to name the pieces. They told Sarah as simply as they could. She was 6. She listened, holding Mr. Buttons, and then asked if she would still see him on Saturdays. He said yes. He did not know how thin that promise would become. The first months of the new arrangement carried a brittle hope. He picked Sarah up every other Friday evening and returned her Sunday afternoon. Linda made an effort at the beginning, special meals, a rented movie, a trip to the zoo. Sarah remained polite and distant. She ate what was offered. She answered questions with the fewest possible words. At night, she slept in the guest room with the door slightly open and the rabbit tucked under her chin. Thomas would stand in the hallway after she was asleep and feel the full strangeness of the life he had chosen. The apartment was larger than the house on Maple Street. The furniture was newer. Nothing in it felt like home. Linda's patience with the visits thinned as the months passed. She never said Sarah was a burden. She simply arranged her own schedule so that she was often absent when the child was present. Thomas told himself this was understandable. A woman who had already left one marriage should not be expected to mother another woman's daughter. He told himself many careful sentences that allowed him to continue. By the time Sarah was 8, the visits had become monthly. The phone calls between them were short and careful. He sent the support checks without fail. He remembered birthdays. He told himself these things added up to fatherhood. The truth lived in the quieter moments. The way Sarah no longer ran to the door when he arrived, the way she said goodbye without looking at him, the way Mr. Buttons began to look more worn and more necessary each time he saw her. When the diagnosis came in the autumn of 1995, the careful structure he had built around his new life showed its first real crack. Diane's voice on the telephone carried no accusation, only the flat exhaustion of someone who had already spent days in doctors' offices and was now required to ask for help from the one person least inclined to give it. He listened. He said he would look into the options. He hung up and sat in the closed office with the sound of the plant floor pressing against the walls. That night, Linda listened to the details with the same calm attention she gave to household budgets. Her response was practical, measured, and final in the way practical things often are. The specialized treatment was expensive. The outcome was uncertain. They had their own future to protect. He nodded. He said he understood. The next day he made the call to Diane and drew the line he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. He did not visit the hospital during the first rounds of chemotherapy. He sent the card and the check and told himself the doctors knew best. He told himself children recovered. He told himself the standard protocol would be enough. Each sentence was a small door closed against the larger truth. The final telephone call in March 1997 arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. Diane's sister spoke in the controlled voice people use when the news is already past changing. Thomas left the plant and drove to Dayton with the radio silent. He sat in the parking lot longer than he should have. When he finally went inside, the room was dim and quiet except for the machines. Sarah looked impossibly small in the bed. The rabbit was there as it had always been. He said her name. Her eyes opened. For a brief moment, something like recognition passed across her face. Then the effort of staying present seemed to exhaust her. He held her hand. He spoke words he no longer remembers clearly. A nurse asked him to step out. In the hallway, he was told she would not last the night. He drove back to Columbus. Linda met him at the door and told him he had done everything possible. He let the sentence stand because correcting it would have required a courage he no longer possessed. Sarah died the following afternoon while he sat in a meeting that could have been postponed. He learned of it by telephone. He did not go to the funeral. The lilies were ordered by Linda. The card carried both names. That night he drank until the edges of the room softened and the weight in his chest loosened just enough to allow sleep. In the morning he shaved and went to work. The years afterward settled into a long, unmarked corridor. He and Linda continued for a time. The absence of children of their own became a quiet fact rather than a crisis. When she left in 2011, the separation was almost civil. He sold the house, moved nearer the river, and arranged his days around small, repeatable routines. Walking, shopping, paying bills. The people who knew him casually described him as private and steady. None of them knew the shape of the silence he carried. He never spoke Sarah's name. When the question of children arose, he answered with a single word. The lie became habitual. Habit became the only structure left. The letter from the Dayton law firm arrived on an ordinary spring afternoon in 2025. He opened it standing at the kitchen counter. The photograph of Sarah at 7 years old, sitting on the back steps with the rabbit in her lap, looking up at the sky, landed in his hands like something that had been waiting decades to find him. Diane's handwriting on the reverse side was as careful as it had always been when she graded papers. She asked for you every night until the end. I never told her you refused the treatment money. I let her believe you were still trying. He sat at the table until the light failed. Then he placed the photograph in a drawer and closed it. The pain began a few months later. By autumn, the diagnosis had been given, and the hospice room with its view of the river had become the final place he would live. He wrote because the alternative was to die still holding the story inside him. The pages accumulated. The truth, once started, refused to stop. After Sarah's death, the days did not stop. That was the first surprise. The plant still required him at the same hour. The time clock still needed punching. Linda still set a plate in front of him in the evenings and asked, without pressing, how the shift had gone. He answered in the short sentences that had become his habit. The world continued its ordinary motions while something inside him remained fixed at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He returned to work the morning after the funeral he did not attend. The men on the floor nodded to him the way they always had. No one knew. He had never spoken of Sarah at the plant beyond the bare fact that he had a daughter who lived with her mother. The omission had been deliberate even then. Afterward, it became absolute. He moved through the hours with the same competence he had always shown. Production numbers were met. Problems on the floor were solved. At the end of each shift, he drove home to the house in the Columbus suburbs and sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey while Linda watched television in the next room. The distance between them had existed before Sarah's death. Afterward, it simply had more room to grow. He did not speak her name. On the rare occasions when someone asked after his daughter, he said she was fine and changed the subject. The lie required no effort after the first few times. It became another piece of the quiet structure he lived inside. Linda never asked. Whether she sensed the subject was closed or simply preferred not to open it, he never knew. Their conversations stayed on the surface of bills, household repairs, and the small plans that fill a marriage when the larger ones have been set aside. The years settled into a long, unmarked stretch. He received occasional updates from Diane through brief, formal notes: Sarah's school progress before the illness, the name of a new specialist, the dates of hospital stays. He answered none of them after the final refusal of money. When the notes stopped, he told himself it was better that way. The silence protected both of them from further damage. He did not examine the thought closely enough to see the cowardice inside it. Linda's desire for children of their own remained a quiet pressure for several years. Doctor visits, tests, the careful clinical language of fertility specialists. When the results pointed to difficulties on her side, she absorbed the information with the same practical calm she brought to every setback. They stopped talking about it. The guest room stayed empty. The photographs on the shelves continued to show only the two of them. Thomas told himself the absence was a mercy. A child of their own would have required explanations he was no longer capable of giving. By the early 2000s, the marriage had become a shared arrangement of convenience more than a living bond. They ate meals together. They paid the mortgage. They attended the required company functions and smiled for the necessary photographs. At night, they slept in the same bed without touching. Thomas lay awake listening to the sound of the furnace cycling on and off and thought of nothing he was willing to name. The whiskey helped on the harder nights. He was careful never to let it become obvious. When Linda told him in 2011 that she was leaving, the conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. She had met someone. The man had 2 sons already in their teens and a cabin on a lake. She wanted a life that felt forward-looking. Thomas listened and nodded. He felt neither surprise nor the sharp edge of betrayal. What he felt was closer to a tired recognition that the structure they had built was finally being dismantled by someone with enough energy left to do it. He signed the papers without argument. She took the furniture she wanted. He kept the house long enough to sell it at a modest profit and then moved into a smaller place near the river on the east side of the city. The new apartment was adequate. 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen, a living room with a window that looked out on a quiet street. He furnished it with the pieces he needed and nothing more. The routines he built there were deliberately narrow. Morning walk along the river path. Coffee at the same diner 3 blocks away. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays. Bills paid on the first of the month. He spoke to almost no one beyond the necessary exchanges of daily life. The neighbors considered him polite and private. The cashier at the grocery store knew his face but not his name. He preferred it that way. He never returned to Kettering. He never drove past the house on Maple Street. On the rare occasions when memory rose unbidden, the sound of a child laughing in a park, the sight of a worn stuffed animal in a store window, he turned away from it with the same practiced motion he used to change the subject in conversation. The discipline required effort at first. Later it became automatic. The letter from the Dayton law firm arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 2025. He had just returned from his walk. The envelope was thick, formal, addressed in a clerk's careful hand. He opened it standing at the kitchen counter. Inside was a brief note explaining that Diane Reynolds had passed away and that among her personal effects was an item directed to him. The photograph slipped out into his hand before he was ready. Sarah at 7, sitting on the back steps of the Maple Street house. Mr. Buttons in her lap. Her face turned upward toward the sky the way it always had when she watched for airplanes. The image was sharp, the colors only slightly faded by time. On the reverse side, Diane's handwriting, still the neat script of a woman who had spent years teaching children to form their letters properly. She asked for you every night until the end. I never told her you refused the treatment money. I let her believe you were still trying. He stood without moving for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. The ordinary sounds of the afternoon continued as if nothing had changed. He set the photograph on the counter and sat down at the small table. The light shifted across the room as the sun lowered. He did not turn on a lamp. When the room was fully dark, he rose, placed the photograph in the drawer of the side table, and closed it. He did not look at it again for 6 months. The pain began in August, a deep, persistent ache low in the abdomen that did not respond to the ordinary remedies. He ignored it at first the way he had ignored other signals over the years. By September, the ache had become constant enough that he made an appointment. The tests followed quickly. The oncologist was direct in the manner of someone who had delivered the same news many times. Pancreatic cancer already advanced. Options were limited. Prognosis was measured in months rather than years. Thomas listened and asked the practical questions. How long? What could be done for comfort? Whether there was any point in aggressive treatment. The answers were clear. He declined the chemotherapy. He signed the papers that arranged for hospice care when the time came. He returned to the apartment and sat at the table looking at the closed drawer of the side table for a long while before he opened it and took the photograph out again. This time he studied it under the light. The details he had refused for decades returned with force. The exact tilt of her head, the way one of the rabbit's ears was permanently bent, the small scuff on the step where she always sat. He placed the photograph on the table and left it there. In the days that followed, he found himself looking at it without planning to. The image did not accuse. It simply remained. By early October, the pain had increased enough that living alone was no longer practical. He arranged the move to Riverside Hospice himself. The room they gave him looked out on the Ohio River. He requested legal pads and pens the first afternoon. The nurses assumed he was writing letters. He did not correct them. He began with the facts as he remembered them, setting each one down without ornament. The house on Maple Street, the birth, the ordinary years, the seminar in Chicago, the slow leaving, the diagnosis, the refusal, the final afternoon. He wrote through the evenings and into the nights when sleep would not come. The pages accumulated in a neat stack on the small table beside the chair. Carol, the nurse who checked on him most often, noticed the growing pile but asked no questions beyond the necessary ones about pain and comfort. Her presence was steady without being intrusive. On the fourth day, he asked her for an envelope and stamps. He had decided the pages needed to leave the room. Michael was the only name that remained. He sealed the envelope and watched her take it away. The act of sending the words out into the world changed something in the air of the room. The confession was no longer private. Whatever came next would arrive on its own terms. He continued writing while he waited. The later pages moved more slowly. The pain medication dulled the edges of thought, and he refused the stronger doses that would have made the work impossible. He wanted the record complete and clear. He wrote about the years of silence, the careful answers to casual questions, the way he had trained himself never to look directly at the memory. He wrote about the afternoon the photograph arrived and the 6 months he spent refusing to open the drawer again. He wrote until the only thing left was the final accounting. When Michael's call came, and later when he stood in the doorway of the sunroom, Thomas met the younger man's eyes without looking away. He had no defense to offer and no request to make. The truth had been set down. That was all he had left to give. After Michael left with the finished pages, Thomas sat for a long time watching the river. The light changed. The water kept its steady movement toward the west. He felt no relief and no dramatic lifting of weight. What he felt was closer to the quiet that follows when a long, necessary task has finally been completed. He slept that night without the usual interruptions. In the morning, Carol found him still in the chair, the legal pad closed, the pen on the floor. The river outside held the same color it had carried every day since he arrived. The rest followed as it had to. Michael took the pages. The burial was simple. The stone carried only the necessary information. The river continued. The record remained.